Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, where we take up important articles of the day from the newspaper and discuss them in detail as per the demands of Civil Services exam. Articles covered today are displayed on your screen and their notes in PDF and Word format are provided in the description box down below. Without further ado, let us begin.
Now, starting off with the first article of the day, which appeared on page 1 of today's Hindu newspaper. In this article, government it restricted all imports of laptops, tablets, and all-in-one personal computers. Further, importing such products would require licenses, and hence it is quite natural from the news that the government it wants to discourage imports for such products. This would mean that the domestic demand for such products will need to be met by domestic manufacturing. Hence, this measure acts as a boost for domestic sector in India. Now, in this regard, the topic for today's discussion is the product linked incentive scheme, as this scheme has been in news throughout the year for one reason or the other, and it makes the topic important from prelims and mains point of view, which is apparent from this PYQ of the year 2023 only, as it asked question directly on production linked incentive scheme. Further, in the mains of the year 2017, a question it appeared on failure of manufacturing sector in achieving the goals of labor intensive exports. Hence, this topic is also important from GS paper 3 perspective, which deals with effects of liberalization and changes in industrial policy. Now, in the scope of today's discussion on PLI scheme, we will first cover key features before discussing the significance of such scheme for domestic manufacturing. Also, we will discuss the issues that implementation of this scheme faces, in addition to a way forward that will suggest measures to improve the implementation of PLI scheme. Hence, let us start off our today's discussion with key features of PLI scheme. Now, production linked incentive, it refers to a rebate which is usually given to the producers, and this rebate is calculated based on certain percentage of sales of producers. Now, the PLI scheme, it is an outcome based scheme, which means that incentives it will be disbursed to the producer only after the production has taken place, and the calculation of such incentives are done in two different forms. The first parameter is that of incremental production, as this is calculated on the basis of incremental sales. For example, an industrial unit it produces 100 units of goods in a particular year. However, in the next year it produces 150 units. Hence, the incentive it would be provided for additional of 50 units only. Now, this incentive it starts from as low as 1%, for example, for electronics and technology products, and it goes up to a level of 20% for manufacturing of key pharmaceutical products. Further, the second parameter for this incentive is based on number of sales, performance of the company, or value addition which is done by the company. And this incentive will be provided for a period of 5 years. Further, the PLI scheme it focuses on size and scale by selecting only those players who can deliver the required number of volumes. Also, the selection of sectors for this scheme is very wide, as it covers cutting edge technology sectors as well as sectors which are important for integration of India with global value chains. Further, it also includes job creating sectors and sectors who are closely linked with rural economy. Additionally, this scheme is designed in such a way that it is compatible with India's commitment to the World Trade Organization, as the quantum of support is not directly linked to export. Now, this scheme currently has been rolled out for manufacturing of 14 sectors. Now, the PLI scheme for electronics and technology products comes under the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Now, after we have discussed the key features of such scheme, let us take a look at what is the significance of a PLI scheme for domestic manufacturing in India. Now, the first significance of production linked incentive scheme is that it will help India utilize its comparative advantage. Now, as we know, India has a comparative advantage in terms of huge market, as well as India has a large pool of skilled and semi-skilled labor force. Hence, production linked incentive will help India utilize its huge market and a burgeoning labor force in order to undertake competitive manufacturing of key products. Further, PLI scheme increases the ability of India to tap high global and domestic demand. As this scheme, it will help satisfy the growing domestic demand for respective sectors. Additionally, it will also lead to huge export of key products. For example, demand for electronics such as laptops and mobile will see a huge rise post controls on import of such products. And hence, a domestic manufacturing industry will play a key role in meeting this domestic demand. Further, this scheme helps develop of high potential sectors, as sectors who are not currently very significant economy wise, but they have a huge socio-economic potential can be grown using this scheme. For example, development of a food processing industry will help farmers get better price for their farm produce. Also, it will help reduce food wastage that is prevalent in India currently. Also, this scheme helps attract global manufacturers. In line of China plus one strategy, key global manufacturers are looking for alternate markets for manufacturing of their products. And in this regard, India could attract big global IT hardware manufacturers who want to shift their production base from China to India. Additionally, it will also give a boost to local production of laptops, servers, and personal computers, among others. Further, PLI scheme is expected to generate huge employment in India. As expected incremental production, it is expected to reach about 3.35 lakh crores in the next year. And this scheme, it could help generate 75,000 direct jobs. And if you take into account number of indirect jobs, it could touch to the levels of 2 lakh employment. Further, this scheme also promotes private investment. As the government, it cannot continue making investments. Hence, there is a need for private investment in Indian economy. And from the perspective of Indian industry, this scheme indicates an attitudinal shift from discouragement to encouragement for large industries. And simultaneously, it provides government with a much needed fiscal space for other social sector responsibilities. Now, after we have discussed the significance of production linked incentive scheme, we must also take a look at issues that the implementation of such scheme faces. Now, there are potential issues that are associated with production linked incentive scheme. The first is that there are absence of common parameters, as currently there are no common set of parameters to understand the level of value addition that are done by the companies or the likely incentives that are available to companies. And also, at present, there are different ministries who are involved in monitoring of value addition in their respective PLI schemes. Thus, it provides no way to compare two different schemes under two different ministries. Further, the scheme offers multiple deliverables, as there are various deliverables such as number of jobs created or rise in exports or quality improvement. And also, there is a no centralized database to gauge all these deliverables simultaneously. Additionally, this scheme also has steep targets. For example, as for information technology hardware sector, until last fiscal, only 3 or 4 companies became eligible for incremental sales targets. And hence, out of only 14, only these 3-4 companies were able to qualify for PLI scheme incentives. Also, there's a need to design sector specific incentives, as the implementation of PLI schemes in electronics and pharmaceutical sector, they highlight that every sector has a different eligibility threshold, and given the large number of activities that are covered under 14 eligible sectors, thereby determining a threshold would become a difficult task. Also, there have been allegations that PLI scheme it interferes with natural economic process, as in the long run, an economy can become competitive only when sectors die naturally and be born again. And in this regard, resource it gets reallocated to sectors that see high productivity growth. However, PLI scheme it offers external interference which may eventually hinder optimized allocation of natural and fiscal resources. Also, this scheme offers relative disadvantage to sectors who are not covered under PLI scheme, as the limited resource of the economy in form of capital and human resources, it will be nudged towards incentivized sectors, which mean that it will directly disincentivize other excluded sectors. Now that we have looked at different issues that are prevalent in implementation of PLI scheme, let us discuss the measures that can be undertaken to ameliorate these issues and further improve the implementation of PLI scheme. Hence, let us take a look at different improvement measures. The first is that there is a need for a predefined sunset clause, as it will not only be beneficial for the sector in the long run, it will also encourage individual players to see that such incentives are only a one-time opportunity, which then can be utilized for effective capacity building. Also, there is a need to improve technological competence of different private players, as these incentives it can be used by industry players to increase their technological competence, and it will help transition of domestic sector to become globally competitive. Also, there is a need to improve the business environment of the company, and it can be done by improving the transparency and predictability of the policy framework. For example, simplification of tax regime or easing the land acquisition process, it would become helpful for participants in the PLI scheme. Also, there is an imperative need to manage our real exchange rate in a better way, as real exchange rate, which is adjusted for inflation in India, it appreciated about 19% in the last decade, which was on account of increased foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment. And this appreciation in real exchange rate, it has negatively impacted our overall exports. Further, there is a need to augment industrial infrastructure and connectivity, and this can be done by increasing expenditure on infrastructure creation. This expenditure will help improve India's export competitiveness. Additionally, there is a requirement for regular scheme review, as it will help keep the track of progress and address concerns which may be associated with raw materials, funds, skilling of workforce, or payment of incentives, etc. Finally, there is a need for increased investment in innovation, research, and skill development, as it is a necessary ingredient for success of PLI scheme. Hence, it can be said that the PLI scheme and its associated ecosystem, they have ensured that India is well positioned to develop a resilient global value chain. However, the incentives that are provided in PLI scheme, it needs to be well crafted and temporary, so that the industries receiving this support can mature and become economically viable even without the government's protection. Thereby, keeping incentives in place for too long will rather slow down the economic progress of key manufacturing sectors. Thereby, having a predefined sunset clause improving technological competence and business environment in the country, managing a real exchange rate in a better way, augmenting industrial infrastructure and connectivity, undertaking regular review of the scheme, and increased investment in innovation, research and skilling will help implementation of production linked incentive scheme. This was all for today's discussion on the first article. Now moving on to the second article of the day, which also appeared in page 1 of today's Hindu newspaper. This article reports that the Ministry of Home Affairs, it has withdrawn the permit that was given to an NGO called Save the Children, and this permit was given under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act or FCRA. Hence, this news brings our attention towards NGOs regulation in India. Now, non-governmental organization, they are important from GS paper 2 perspective, as it highlights development process and development industry, specifically with the roles of NGOs in it. Also, in the mains of the year 2015, a question directly appeared on recent changes that were then made to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act of the year 1976. Additionally, important NGOs which are in news are also important from prelims perspective, which is apparent from this prelims PYQ of the year 2015 on Amnesty International. Hence, in the scope of today's discussion, we will first take a look about what are NGOs and how they play a key role in development in Indian society. Additionally, we will further cover the need for regulation of NGOs and how FCRA regulates NGOs specifically with 2020 rules that were introduced recently. Then, we will discuss the concerns that were associated with amendment to FCRA in addition to suggesting a way forward for improvement of NGO regulation in India. Hence, let us start off our today's discussion about knowing what are NGOs. Now, a non-governmental organization, also known as NGO, they are defined as a non-profit institution which pursue activities to relieve suffering, promote the interests of poor, protect the environment, provide basic social services, or undertake community development. Now, these organizations, they are not part of the government. However, they have a legal status such that they may be registered as a trust or a society or a private limited non-profit company. Now, the Constitution of India, it provides backing to such organizations. For example, in Article 19 subsection 1, it allows the right to form associations. Further, Article 43 of the Directive Principles, it promotes the formation of cooperatives in rural areas. Also, the list third, also known as concurrent list under the 7th schedule, it mentions charitable and religious institutions. An NGO can be all three organizations which are provided with constitutional backing. Now, after we have discussed what are NGOs, let us take a look at their roles in development in Indian society. Now, NGOs, they work in areas, especially where state is currently unwilling. For example, it helps deal with caste-based discrimination. Now we know that caste-based discrimination, despite being prohibited by the Constitution, is very much prevalent in Indian society. Now NGOs, they help members of marginalized section realize their fundamental rights, and they also raise awareness among people to discourage caste-based discrimination. Further, NGOs, they also work in areas where state resources have proven to be inadequate. For example, NGOs are actively involved in education and healthcare sector. Additionally, NGOs, they also help in fighting off social evils, such as there are many campaigns by NGOs to highlight ban on sex selective abortions. Further, NGOs also provide shelters to members of marginalized communities, such as communities they get displaced due to demolition of slums. They also provide shelter to victims of heat waves and cold waves. Also, NGOs help ensure people to demand accountability from the government. As NGOs, they played a key role in passage of RTI Act. Also, NGOs helps in implementing welfare schemes. For example, they have key role in implementation of Forest Rights Act, Compensatory Afforestation Act. Additionally, they also provide with rehabilitation post disaster events, and they also help in case study and verification of implementation of governmental welfare schemes. Now we have discussed the key role that NGO plays in Indian society. Let us discuss why is there a need for regulation of such NGOs. Now the need for regulation of NGOs comes from many reasons. The first is that there is a need to check misuse of foreign funding. And for this reason, the government has banned over 14,500 NGOs which were registered under FCRA Act from receiving of foreign funds. Also, regulation they help with deal with non-compliance. As according to a CBI report, out of 29 lakh registered NGOs in India, only less than 10% of NGOs they file their annual income and expenditure accounts. And more than 90% of NGOs they do not submit their balance sheet for monitoring. Also, NGOs they have a negative impact on developmental activities. As according to an Intelligence Bureau report, foreign aided NGOs they actively stall developmental projects which then impacts the GDP growth at about 2 to 3% per annum. Also, NGOs they encroach on people's right to freedom of religion. As many NGOs, they have misused their influence to sell foreign narratives and push vested interest which promote religious conversion. Hence, regulation it will help negate encroachment on right to religion. Now we have discussed the need for such regulation. Let us discuss the role of Foreign Contribution Regulation Act in this regard. Now, foreign funding of NGOs, it is regulated in India under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which ensures that the recipients they adhere to stated purpose for which the contribution has been obtained. And FCRA it consolidates the law to regulate the acceptance and utilization of foreign contribution which can be done by individuals or associations who are involved in non-governmental organizations. Now, latest in this regard was 2020 rules, which prohibited the public servants from accepting the foreign contribution. And it may also include any person who may be in service of the government or is getting remuneration by the government for performance of a public duty. This rule it also prohibits transfer of foreign contribution to any other person. Additionally, this rule makes Aadhaar mandatory for registration, while in the case of foreigners, they need to provide a copy of their passport or the Overseas Citizen of India card for purpose of registration. Additionally, this rule makes it mandatory for foreign contribution to be received only on a designated account in SBI located in New Delhi, and this account will be designated as a FCRA account. Also, the renewal of licenses of NGOs under this act will be received only when the government conducts an inquiry. Also, this rule decreases the amount of administrative expenses that an NGO can utilize through use of foreign funds. Earlier, 50% of foreign funds can be utilized for administrative expenses. However, this rule reduces it to 20% only. Also, this rule provides for suspension of registration. As government, it may suspend the registration of a person for not exceeding 180 days, and this suspension may be further exceeded by additional of 180 days. However, such amendments to FCRA Act has brought about certain concerns. Let us discuss this in the next slide. Now, restrictions of FCRA, it makes it difficult for smaller NGOs to accessible funds. As currently, many large NGOs, they grant funds to smaller NGOs. However, this has been prohibited under the rule, thereby making it difficult for smaller NGOs to seek foreign contributions. Further, the FCRA rules, they restrict the use of foreign contribution for utilization of administrative expenses, as only 20% of foreign contribution currently can be used for administrative experiences. Hence, smaller NGOs, they will not be able to employ enough staff, hire experts, and implement strategies that they may be required. Further, the FCRA rules, they hamper delivery of welfare schemes. As such restrictions, they may have far-reaching consequences on fields of education, health, and livelihood because NGOs, they provide last mile connectivity for delivery of government services in such fields. Now, to conclude, we can say that civil society organizations, they seek accountability from others. Thereby, it is their moral obligation to be accountable and transparent. Hence, the regulation by the government, it should balance their freedom and functioning with need for stringent regulation in Indian society. And in this regard, let us discuss two committee suggestions. The first is Vijay Kumar Committee recommendations, which highlighted the need for modernization of registration process of NGOs. Additionally, the committee also recommended that the details of NGOs, it needs to be available for public through a searchable database. The second recommendation in this regard comes from second ARC, and it said that there is a need for FCRA provisions to be decentralized, and hence the FCRA regulation, it can be delegated to state governments or district administration. Further, second ARC, it also highlighted the need for balance between the purpose of legislation and the functioning of voluntary sector in order to avoid the subjective interpretation of laws and their possible misuse. Hence, by modernizing the registration, making the details of NGOs public, decentralizing the implementation of FCRA, and ensuring a balance between legislation and functioning of NGOs is key to regulate NGOs in India. This was all for today's discussion on regulation of NGOs. Now moving on to the last article of the day, which appeared on page 12 of today's Hindu newspaper. Now on August the 1st, the Rajya Sabha, it passed the Biological Diversity Amendment Bill of the year 2021. As the original act, that is the Biodiversity Act of the year 2002, it seeks to conserve biodiversity, promote its sustainable use, as well as promote the equitable sharing of benefits that arise out of biodiversity. However, the amendments that are proposed in the 2021 bill, it seeks to ensure ease of doing business as well as promotion of Ayush industry. And hence, in this regard, the topic of biological diversity is important from GS Paper 3 perspective, which specifically mentions environment and biodiversity. Also, in the previous year question of the year 2020, a question appeared on environmental impact assessment notification of the year 2020. Additionally, this topic is also important from prelims point of view, which can be seen from this PYQ of the year 2023 on biodiversity management committees and Nagoya Protocol. Hence, in the scope of today's discussion, we will first take a look at Biodiversity Act of the year 2002, after which we will discuss the amendment bill and its main features. In the end, we will also discuss the concerns that may be associated with such provisions. Hence, let us start off our today's discussion with Biological Diversity Act of the year 2002. Now, the Biological Diversity Act, it was enacted in order to provide for conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, and equitable sharing of its benefits that arise out of biological resource and knowledge. The aim in order to bring this bill was to fulfill India's obligation to Convention of Biodiversity and Nagoya Protocol, which was on access and benefit sharing of biodiversity. Now this act, it provides for a decentralized three-tiered mechanism which was provided for implementation of this act. A National Biodiversity Authority is at the apex level of this decentralized mechanism. This authority is a statutory body. It facilitates and regulates the activities which pertains to access of biological resources, associated knowledge, sharing of benefits which arise out of the use of such biological resources. Additionally, it also provides for publication of internationally recognized certificates of compliance, also known as IRCC. And it also provides technical support to states for notifying biodiversity heritage sites. The second tiered mechanism is that of state biodiversity boards, which are now constituted in 28 states and 8 union territories. In order to further strengthen the state biodiversity boards, the National Biodiversity Authority, it provides for necessary technical and financial assistance to such biodiversity boards. The third mechanism is that of biodiversity management committees, also known as BMCs, and they have been constituted by the local bodies in state and union territories. Total of more than 2.76 lakhs of biodiversity management committees, they have been constituted in 28 states and 7 union territories. One of the responsibilities of BMC, it is to prepare the People's Biodiversity Register, also known as PBRs, which can be done in consultation with local people. Now in total, about 2.66 lakhs of People's Biodiversity Registers have been prepared across the country. Now, after we have taken a brief overview of what is a Biological Diversity Act, let us take a look at provisions that the Amendment Bill of 2021 brings. Now, this Amendment Bill, it provides extension to certain exemptions under the Biological Diversity Act. Now, people who practice indigenous medicine systems, such as Ayush practitioners, they are now exempted from giving prior intimation to state biodiversity boards in order to access biological resources for certain purposes. Further, this amendment bill, it also simplifies the access to biological resources and intellectual property rights. As the bill, it provides that approval will be only required before the grant of IPR instead of before the application itself. And this bill specifies distinct approval process based on origin of entity. Now, foreign entities will require approval from National Biodiversity Authority, whereas domestic entities, they will be required only to register with National Biodiversity Authority. However, domestic entities, they will need approval from National Biodiversity Authority at the time of commercialization of their intellectual property rights. Further, this bill also provides for reduction of certain offences. As the original act, it provided for offences that were cognizable and non-bailable in nature. And now, these non-bailable and cognizable offences have been deleted. However, penalties may still extend up to rupees 1 crore. Further, this bill also seeks to amend provision related to biodiversity management committees, as state government will now prescribe the composition of BMCs whose strength have been fixed between 7 to 11 members. Further, state governments, They may also constitute BMCs at intermediate or district panchayat level. Additionally, this bill also includes that the states they can now declare threatened species, as the central government can delegate power to notify any species which is near extinction as threatened species to the state governments. However, before notifying any threatened species, the state government it must consult the National Biodiversity Authority. Further, this bill also provides expansion of membership for National Biodiversity Authority, as it also includes provision for 11 additional members, which includes 6 members who will be ex officio members dealing with wildlife, forestry research, and Panchayati Raj, whereas 4 representatives will be from state biodiversity boards, and these will be on a rotational basis. Additionally, this amendment bill also provides for one member secretary who must have an experience in biodiversity conservation, and this member secretary will also be the chief coordinating officer of the National Biodiversity Authority. Also, this bill makes changes in certain definitions. For example, the provision for bioutilization has been removed, while on the other hand, the term biosurvey has been redefined. Now that we have discussed the key provisions of amendment bill, let us discuss the concerns that are associated with such amendments. The first concern associated with the amendment bill, as there are fears that large companies they might evade the provisions of Biodiversity Act, as majority of Ayush firms they are registered under the name of practicing Ayush doctors, and hence these firms will then be excluded from provisions of Biodiversity Act, and it will also be difficult to certify whether the raw material which are used by such large companies came from forest areas or cultivated lands. Further, there have been issues which are related to change in definitions, as there's a threat to biopiracy due to deletion of term of bioutilization, an array of activities like characterization, inventorization, and bioassay which are undertaken in commercial interest, they may go unnoticed. Further, replacing the term of biological resource or knowledge with just results of research may open channels for anyone who can obtain permission from the National Biodiversity Authority to transfer the biological resource or knowledge to any third party without any restriction or cognizance of the National Biodiversity Authority. Also, there are uncertainty regarding regulation of biosurveys, as studies and tests that the researchers use to understand physical, chemical, and other characteristic of a resources, for example a plant, have all been eliminated from the bill, which leads to uncertainty on how these biosurveys will then be regulated. Further, there have been issues with the post of member secretary as well, as it can create two power centers inside the National Biodiversity Authority, one being the chairperson, other being the member secretary. Hence, these amendments they bring back the focus on protecting the interest of local communities and sharing the profits with these communities. Hence, the main focus of any legislation it should be in order to protect the India's rich biodiversity. In order to provide for conservation of biological diversity, allow sustainable use of biological resources, and provide for equitable sharing of benefits of such biological resources. This was all for today's discussion on Biological Diversity Amendment Bill of the year 2021.